They said it was just a misunderstanding. But how do you forget to invite your own daughter to a wedding you're hosting at her resort? I didn't protest. I didn't show up. I just watched the guest list cross my name out while my signature approved the venue. Years later, when their perfect day began to fall apart, they demanded to meet the owner in charge. And when I stepped forward, they finally realized the daughter they dismissed now owned everything they once used to control. I'm Madeline Pierce, and this is how silence turned into my inheritance. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe /like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The city below is already awake, boats moving in the bay, traffic rolling over the Zakim Bridge. But inside my office, it's quiet enough to hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. I scroll through a stack of digital contracts on my monitor, all clean and precise, until an email notification flashes across the top of the screen. Subject: Pierce West Wedding Contract. Grand Belmont Resort. My finger hovers over the mouse for half a second before I open it. It's a standard agreement, another luxury event booked at one of my properties in Newport. I skim the terms automatically. Dates, catering, deposits, until I reach the attached guest list. Pierce family. The name hits like a soft tap, not a punch. Still, my pulse changes. I scroll slowly through the list until I see it. Madeline Pierce, not attending. I lean back in my chair, the leather creaking slightly, and let out a sound that isn't quite a laugh. Of course I whisper to no one. The bitterness tastes familiar, almost comforting now. The cursor blinks at the bottom of the screen, waiting for a response. I don't type anything. Instead, my mind drifts back to the night it all started to unravel. It was Christmas Eve, 2018. The Pierce family dining room was filled with candlelight and too much red wine. My father, Richard, in his tailored gray suit, sat at the head of the table like a man presiding over a board meeting instead of dinner. He had that look he always wore when he was about to say something final. Chin lifted, voice calm, the kind of tone that left no room for reply. Men lead, he said, swirling his glass of Cabernet. Women support. You should learn that from your brother Madeline. Andrew, sitting next to him, smirked down at his plate. I was 27, working 70-hour weeks at Pierce Capital, the company my father built from scratch, running numbers for deals that Andrew would later present as his own. I remember staring at the string lights blinking in the window and thinking that maybe the problem wasn't that I didn't fit in, but that I never wanted to. Mom, Eleanor, tried to smooth the silence that followed her voice, small Richard maybe. He waved her off. It's just the truth. The steak knife in my hand felt heavier than it should have. I put it down quietly, pushed back my chair, and stood. "Where are you going?" my mother asked, half rising. "Out," I said, my voice steady, even though something inside me cracked right down the middle. I walked away from the table, the smell of roasted lamb and pine fading behind me. That was the last family dinner I ever attended. Back in the present, my phone buzzes on the desk, pulling me out of the memory. I glance at the screen. Noah Blake, operations director. I swipe to answer. "Morning," he says, cheerful as always. "The monthly reports look solid. Occupancy rates are up 5%. Only thing left is the wedding contract for Grand Belmont. Still waiting for your final signature." "Leave it as it is," I say. "You sure the client's name?" "I saw it." I pause. "We don't mix business with personal history, Noah. Keep the schedule." He hesitates. "Understood." The call ends. For a moment, all I hear is the faint tick of the wall clock. I rise, walk to the window, and rest a hand against the cool glass. From up here, the city looks orderly, predictable. Everything my family never was. The harbor wind pushes faint ripples across the water. I catch my reflection in the glass black suit, silver earrings, hair pinned neatly back. The image of control, not attending. I murmur again, a wry smile tugging at my lips. They'll celebrate in one of my ballrooms, drink champagne under chandeliers. I chose pose for photos against the marble columns I restored, and they won't even know whose name is on the deed. I turn from the window, pick up my coffee cup, and let the warmth steady my hand. They're holding the wedding, I whisper almost to myself, in a place that belongs to me. The taste of irony is sharper than the coffee. I set the cup down, the sound of porcelain on glass echoing softly through the quiet office. The cursor on my monitor still blinks beside the words, "Not attending." My gaze hardens. The game hasn't even begun, but I'm ready. The glass walls of the conference room reflected a line of gray clouds crawling over downtown Boston. I remember standing there, my presentation cued on the screen, palms damp, even though I'd practiced every word. It was 2016. I was 26, still trying to prove that I belonged in Pierce Capital for something more than my last name. My slides detailed an investment strategy for a municipal development project, the Boston Urban Fund, a clean, scalable model to bring private equity into underfunded city infrastructure. It was smart, ambitious, and entirely mine. Across the table, my father sat in his usual seat at the head suit, immaculate hands clasped like a judge waiting for a verdict. Andrew leaned back beside him, confident as ever, scrolling through his phone. The partners, all men in their 50s, whispered to one another, their cufflinks glinting under the recessed lights. I started speaking, outlining the data, the projections, the potential returns. For a few minutes, the room actually listened. Then, halfway through, Andrew cut in smoothly. "What Madeline means," he said, taking the remote from my hand, "is that if we shift the investment window 6 months, we can double the yield." I froze. That wasn't what I'd said, but it sounded good enough that no one questioned it. My father nodded, pleased. "That's solid thinking, Andrew. I like where your head's at." A flicker of heat rushed up my neck. "That was my idea," I said quietly. No one heard me. Or maybe they chose not to. The meeting went on. Numbers, projections, laughter. My father's voice rose above the rest. "Let's move forward on Andrew's proposal. Good work, son." When the room emptied, I stayed behind gathering my papers. My hands trembled just enough to make the pages slip. Through the glass, I watched my father clap Andrew on the back, both of them smiling as if I didn't exist. The hallway outside smelled faintly of cologne and power. I walked out past the receptionist's polite smile into the elevator. The mirrored doors closed, catching my reflection. Flushed cheeks, clenched jaw. When the elevator reached the ground floor, Linda Morales was waiting in the lobby. She'd been Pierce Capital's corporate attorney for years, a woman who managed to stay respected in a building full of men who rarely listened to one. "Rough meeting?" she asked. I tried to smile. "You heard. Everyone did." She handed me a coffee. "You'll learn something, though." "What's that?" "That sometimes the problem isn't that they don't hear you," she said. Eyes kind but sharp. "It's that you're in the wrong room." I let out a soft, humorless laugh. "And where exactly is the right one?" "You'll find it," she said. "Probably by building it yourself." Her words stayed with me long after she walked away. That night, I sat in my small apartment, surrounded by drafts of proposals and spreadsheets that no one in that boardroom had cared to read. The city outside buzzed faintly through the window. I lit a match and watched the first page curl in flame. The ink turned black, then disappeared. The smell of burnt paper filled the room. When I heard footsteps behind me, I didn't have to turn. My father's voice came from the doorway. "What are you doing?" "Cleaning up." He stepped closer, saw the small fire in the trash bin, the edges of my contract folding in on themselves. His expression didn't change. "You're wasting your time." I thought it was mine to waste. "Madeline," he said evenly, "you need to understand your place in this family, in this company. Andrew's meant to lead. You have other strengths. Use them." I met his eyes, like staying quiet. He frowned as if the question were childish, like being supportive. "You'll thank me one day." I pressed my lips together to keep from laughing. "I doubt that." He watched the paper burn until only gray ash remained, then left the room without another word. For a long time, I just sat there, listening to the hum of the radiator and the faint echo of his footsteps fading down the hall. When the last ember went dark, I whispered to the empty apartment, "I do know my place. It just isn't here." I packed that night, one suitcase, a few files, my laptop. There was no grand exit, no confrontation, just quiet resolve. I left my key on the counter, stepped into the freezing December air, and started walking. Boston's skyline shimmered ahead, glass and steel rising against the snow-heavy sky. I didn't have a plan, just an ache and a certainty that I'd never walk back into Pierce Capital again. When I reached an intersection near the harbor, a billboard caught the glare of the streetlight. Land opportunities, coastal estates for sale. I stopped, looking up at it, my breath visible in the cold. Somewhere deep in my chest, something shifted. Anger, grief, or maybe the beginning of ambition. That night, standing under that sign, I made myself a promise. If they wouldn't let me sit at their table, I'd build one of my own. 3 years later, I learned that silence can build things. Pierce Holdings headquarters sat in the Seaport District now, glass and steel rising above the Boston waterfront, as polished and deliberate as the life I'd built since walking away from my family's company. I'd learned to make decisions quickly, to sign my name on contracts without hesitation, to measure my success in square footage and market returns instead of my father's approval. That morning I was sitting across from Benjamin Carter, CEO of Ashford Resorts, a man whose tan never seemed to fade and whose suits always matched his cufflinks. He leaned back in the conference chair grinning. "You know, I still don't understand why you don't use the family name. Pierce Holdings could carry a lot more weight if you tied it to Pierce Capital." I met his eyes. "Names don't define value, Ben. Results do." He smiled, conceding. "Fair enough. Still, your father must know what you've built by now." I closed the file in front of me. "If he does, he's never said." He studied me for a moment longer, then stood, extending his hand. "You're tougher than half the men I've worked with, Madeline. I like that." "I don't aim to be tougher," I said, shaking his hand. "Just better." When he left, the room felt quiet again, just the sound of the harbor wind brushing against the windows. I turned my chair slightly, gazing at the skyline reflected in the glass. Boston had always looked different from above. Cleaner, orderly, almost kind. A knock broke my focus. Noah Blake stepped in, carrying a slim folder and his usual nervous energy. "Monthly numbers look great," he said, flipping open the file. "Occupancy's up 6%, the Ashford partnership is tracking ahead of schedule, and Grand Belmont's booked solid for the next 2 quarters. "That's good news," I said, signing the bottom of the report. Also, he hesitated. "There's a new reservation I thought you should see." He handed me a printed sheet. The Grand Belmont's upcoming events list. My eyes scanned down until they landed on one name that froze me in place. Pierce West Wedding. The letters seemed to vibrate against the page when I asked. "Mid-July." Noah said, "Looks like a big one. Family out of Boston. The bride's name is Catherine Pierce." I finished for him. My voice came out quieter than I meant it to. He blinked. "Your sister?" I didn't answer. The paper in my hand felt heavier than it should have. Catherine, Bright adored the Golden One. The sister whose smile could disarm anyone, including our father. My voiceover played in my mind even as I stared at the page. That name. After all these years, it still tightened something in my chest. Noah was watching me carefully. "Do you want me to cancel the booking?" I looked up, meeting his eyes. "No." He seemed surprised. "Are you sure? We could..." "They chose Grand Belmont," I said slowly. "They just don't know who owns it." He nodded, unsure what to say. I placed the paper back in the folder. Keep everything as is. Treat them like any other client. After he left, I sat still for a while, letting the realization settle. It wasn't anger that rose in me this time. It was something quieter, colder, almost like curiosity. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of humor. My phone buzzed on the desk. An email notification appeared from Linda Morales. Subject: Pierce Capital investigation. I opened it. The message was short. "Harold Stein from the SEC reached out. He has reason to believe your father's company is under review for financial misconduct. He asked if I'd confirm past records. Call me." I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I opened my contacts and found Linda's number. She answered on the second ring. "Madeline, I thought you might call. Is it serious?" "It's early, but Harold's a sharp investigator. If he's digging, it's because he found something." I leaned back in my chair, the window light glancing across my desk. "And you think they'll ask me for help?" There was a pause. "If they realize you're in a position to help, yes, but they won't like needing you." A small smile tugged at my mouth. "They never did." Linda's tone softened. "You've built something real, Madeline. Don't let them drag you back into their mess." "I won't," I said. "I'm just watching from a distance." "Good," she replied. "Then watch carefully." When the call ended, I swiveled my chair toward the window again. Outside, the harbor glittered under the noon sun. The glass towers of Boston looked the same as they had the day I walked away, but I wasn't the same person. An hour later, another email arrived from Linda. I clicked it open. "Heard your old company's cracking. Might be poetic if they come knocking for help." I let out a slow breath, feeling the strange weight of inevitability settle over me. The family I'd left behind was stumbling. The company they'd built on pride was beginning to fracture. And now, unknowingly, they were about to hold a wedding at one of my resorts. I folded the email closed, the faintest edge of a smile returning. If irony had a price, this was it. Beacon Hill had a way of pretending time never moved. The same brick facades, the same iron gates, the same polished brass door knockers gleamed under the afternoon light. Behind one of those doors, my family was entertaining. Something they had always done best. From what I heard later, the house smelled of fresh lilies and expensive champagne when the Wests arrived. Richard Pierce greeted them himself, hand extended, his politician's smile perfectly rehearsed. "Bradley," he said, clasping his future son-in-law's hand. "We are honored to have you join the family." Bradley's parents followed all pearls and tailored navy suits, people accustomed to being impressed. Catherine stood in the middle of the foyer, glowing in her tailored white dress, the perfect hostess. "We're so excited to hold the wedding at the Grand Belmont," she said brightly. "It's the most elegant venue in Newport. My planner says it's booked solid for years." Her voice carried the kind of enthusiasm that came from never having been told no. Eleanor smiled from her seat near the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "It sounds beautiful, darling. You'll make a lovely bride." Then after a pause that seemed almost unintentional, she added, "And your sister. Have you spoken to Madeline?" Catherine hesitated just long enough for everyone to notice. We didn't think she'd want to come." Richard's voice cut in smooth as glass. "Madeline made her choice. Let her live with it." The air shifted. Eleanor lowered her eyes, murmuring something about tea. Catherine smoothed her hair, flashing another bright smile. "Anyway, Bradley and I want something timeless. An outdoor ceremony at Sunset Champagne Fountain String Quartet. Very East Coast classic." The Wests nodded approving. No one mentioned me again. Later that evening, when the guests had gone, and the silver trays had been cleared, Richard and Andrew retreated into the study. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them. Andrew laid a stack of papers on the desk, the ink still fresh. "We're short on liquidity for the quarter," he said. "Some of the urban fund assets are underperforming." Richard adjusted his glasses. "You told the board last week everything was fine." "I did," Andrew said quietly. "It was... And now we need to buy time." Richard's eyes hardened. "Then buy it." That was when the knock came. The butler opened the door to reveal a tall man in a dark gray suit holding a folder embossed with the seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission, Mr. Pierce Harold Stein. "I called earlier." Andrew's breath caught. Richard's expression didn't change. "We already sent all relevant documents," he said coolly. Harold nodded. "And yet the commission would like to review some discrepancies in your recent reports. A few missing signatures, a few transactions that don't line up. Standard procedure." "Of course," Richard said, his voice measured. "I'll have our legal counsel prepare whatever you need." Harold gave a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure you will." He handed over a notice, then turned to leave. As soon as the door closed, Andrew spoke quickly. "We can fix this. I just need a few days to clean the files." Richard stared down at the document. "An official summons for a preliminary hearing. No one can know about this," he said finally. "Not your mother, not Catherine. Do you understand?" Andrew nodded, swallowing hard. "What about Madeline?" Richard looked up sharply. "She doesn't exist here anymore." Somewhere across town, I was sitting in my own office, unaware of that exact conversation, but feeling the weight of something stirring in the air. I remember looking out over the harbor, the light fading to a soft gray, and thinking how strange it was that peace could feel so temporary. In my mind, I could almost see the family gathered in that Beacon Hill house, pretending everything was perfect. Catherine in her designer dress, smiling for people who would forget her name by Monday. Andrew still chasing my father's shadow. Eleanor trying to hold the cracks together with polite conversation. I used to think leaving them meant I was free. But freedom, I was learning, had a way of circling back, sometimes wearing a different face, sometimes carrying the same last name. The next morning, an envelope left Harold Stein's office at the SEC. Inside was a formal subpoena addressed to Richard Pierce, demanding his presence at a preliminary hearing scheduled for July. I didn't know it yet, but that letter would find its way into every quiet corner of my old house, every whisper of denial that passed through my family's lips. And when Richard read it, the first words out of his mouth were the same ones that had haunted me for years. "Don't let anyone find out." That night, as the lights of Beacon Hill flickered across the cobblestone streets, my father poured himself a glass of bourbon and stared at the letter. "Especially not Catherine," he said. "She deserves her perfect wedding." He set the glass down the amber liquid, catching the glow of the fire. But perfection, like wealth, never lasts forever. The Grand Belmont always looked different in the early morning, its glass corridors filled with a soft haze of ocean light, the smell of salt drifting in through the open doors. I'd built it that way, every detail considered, the pale marble floors that reflected sunrise, the quiet hum of the lobby that never quite broke into chaos. It was calm, controlled. Everything my life hadn't been back in Boston. I was reviewing the floral layout for the weekend when I heard heels clicking quickly across the marble. A young woman approached, her blonde hair perfectly curled, clipboard in hand, voice sweet but efficient. "Ms. Pierce, I'm Victoria Lane, lead planner from Elegant Occasions. I just wanted to introduce myself and say it's an honor to work with you. I didn't realize we'd be collaborating with someone quite so accomplished." I set down my pen and looked up. "You won't need to flatter me, Ms. Lane. Just do your job well. That'll be honor enough." She flushed but smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Of course. We're finalizing details for the Pierce West wedding. It's going to be stunning. The bride's family is particular." Particular. I asked, though I already knew what she meant. The father's very firm, the mother wants perfection, and the bride, well, she's lovely, but high-strung. You know how it is with old money. I leaned back in my chair. "I know exactly how it is." Victoria laughed lightly, oblivious. "I can imagine. Anyway, we've had some trouble with permits for the floral canopy, but Mrs. Pierce, Eleanor, I think, insisted we get it resolved before Friday. She signed all the contracts personally." The name caught my attention like the faint smell of smoke in a clean room. "Eleanor signed, yes," Victoria said, flipping through her binder. "Under a company name, Pierce Family Events, LLC. I guess they use it for private arrangements. Very organized family." "Organized," I repeated softly. My tone must have changed because she hesitated. I smiled to smooth it over. "Good work, Ms. Lane. Keep me posted on any changes." She nodded, clearly relieved, and hurried off toward the ballroom. I turned back to my laptop, typing a note to Noah. "Pull the full contract file for the Pierce West event. I want to see the signatory details." Within minutes, a PDF appeared in my inbox. I opened it and scrolled through the familiar language of a standard venue lease until I reached the signature page. "Pierce Family Events, LLC, signed by Eleanor M. Pierce." I stared at the screen, tracing my mother's name with my eyes. She'd always handled the details for the family, household staff donations, events. But this, creating a shell company just to sign a wedding contract. That was my father's trick. Avoid liability, stay untouchable, pretend it's all above board. "They still use loopholes to keep their hands clean," I murmured. "Some things never change." Noah appeared in the doorway, a coffee in each hand. "You wanted the contract." "I saw it," I said. He frowned, sensing the shift in my mood. "You okay?" I gestured toward the window. "Tell me something, Noah. Why do people who already have everything keep trying to hide from it?" He blinked, because if they stop hiding, they might have to admit what they've done to get it. I let out a quiet laugh. "Smart answer." He set the coffee down and nodded toward the view. "They're starting the stage setup. Want to take a look?" I followed him out onto the terrace that overlooked the gardens. Below, workers moved across the lawns like clockwork, setting up floral arches and tables. The wind carried the faint sound of someone giving instructions. Catherine's voice. She stood near the fountain, surrounded by decorators and assistants, every gesture confident, rehearsed. She looked exactly as I remembered, polished, radiant, untouched by consequence. Even from a distance, I recognized the tone she used, that sharp edge wrapped in sweetness. "No, the roses should be ivory, not white. It's different, trust me." I stayed in the shadow of the terrace doorway, unseen. My fingers curled loosely around the railing. It's strange, I thought. I didn't come looking for them. They came to me. My phone buzzed. An email notification slid across the screen. "Linda Morales. Harold Stein is digging deeper into Pierce Capital. Are you ready for what's coming?" I read the line twice, the words pulling at something I'd tried to bury. I typed a short reply, "Always," and hit send. When I looked up again, Catherine was laughing with one of the vendors, her hair catching the sunlight. She hadn't changed, not really. Still the daughter everyone adored. Still the picture of everything I wasn't allowed to be. A slow wind swept through the garden, lifting the petals scattered along the grass. I watched them swirl upward, delicate and directionless. The truth was, I never sought revenge. I just learned to stop looking back. But fate had other plans. I turned and walked back into the building, my heels echoing softly on the marble. From the balcony I could still see her. Catherine standing in the garden, pointing toward the archway that would hold her vows. She had no idea that the woman watching from above was the one who owned every inch beneath her feet. And somehow that knowledge felt heavier than triumph. Friday afternoon settled over Newport like gold dust, warm, bright, and just loud enough to remind everyone that perfection had a deadline. From my office window on the top floor of the Grand Belmont, I could see the garden below transforming into a magazine-spread rows of white chairs, hundreds of roses, tables lined with crystal and linen. Somewhere near the archway, Catherine was directing the setup, her hands moving fast, her voice carrying through the courtyard. By 4 o'clock, rehearsal day had turned into something else. Too many people, too many opinions, and one father who couldn't stop barking orders. Down in the main hall, the music from the string quartet screeched mid-note. A light flickered above the stage, then went out completely. What the hell is going on? Richard's voice thundered across the ballroom. He was in a tailored navy suit, his tie already loosened, face red from irritation. Does anyone here know how to do their damn job? Catherine rushed over, waving her planner. Dad, it's fine, they're fixing it. Fixing it, he snapped. The rehearsal starts in 10 minutes. I paid a fortune for this place. Someone better get the manager. Right now. Eleanor hovered near the edge of the chaos, wringing her hands, whispering to one of the decorators. Please, just make sure the lights come back on. Victoria Lane, trying to keep her professional smile, stepped forward. Mr. Pierce, I'll call the resort office immediately. We'll have the owner here within the hour. The owner, he repeated, exasperated. Then get them now. Victoria pulled out her phone, stepping aside. She scrolled through her contact list and pressed the number labeled Belmont Management Office. Upstairs, my desk phone began to ring. Noah, sitting across from me with his laptop, raised a brow. Unknown extension, he said. I picked it up anyway. Pierce Holdings, Madeline speaking. On the other end, Victoria's voice trembled just enough to betray her panic. Ms. Pierce, I am so sorry to bother you, but the rehearsal for the Pierce West wedding is having a minor crisis. The lights and sound went out, and the father of the bride is, well, asking for you. Personally, I could almost hear my father's tone through her words, that same commanding certainty that used to fill every room he entered. Noah watched my face. Do you want me to go down there? I shook my head slowly. No, I'll handle it myself. He hesitated. You're sure? Completely. As I hung up the phone, something settled inside me. Not anger, not even satisfaction, just an eerie calm like the quiet before a storm that had been building for years. I used to think I'd left all of it behind, I said quietly, but the past has a way of calling you back, sometimes with the same voice that once silenced you. Noah didn't ask what I meant. He just nodded, standing as I did. I'll make sure the path's clear. Thank you, I said, already reaching for my jacket. The elevator ride felt slower than usual, each floor humming past like a heartbeat. When the doors opened into the main lobby, the afternoon light had shifted, long shadows stretching across the marble floor, catching in the glass chandelier overhead. The staff straightened as I walked through. Someone whispered my name. Someone else adjusted their tie. I could hear the faint chaos from the garden even before I stepped outside, voices overlapping, instruments tuning a sharp click of Catherine's heels on stone. The sun hung low over the Atlantic, casting everything in gold. The reflection caught on the glass walls as I passed, throwing shards of light across my face. At the end of the corridor, a mirror waited, tall, framed in brass. I stopped in front of it. The woman looking back at me wasn't the one who'd walked out of her father's house years ago. She wasn't trembling anymore. Her posture was easy, her expression still. The navy suit fit her like armor. For a moment, I adjusted the collar, smoothing the fabric with deliberate care. My reflection tilted slightly in the fading light, half shadow, half fire. In the distance, someone shouted, "They need the owner out here now." I smiled faintly. "They'll get her," I whispered. Then I turned toward the doors, the golden light spilling in as the resort staff pushed them open. Every step echoed through the marble hallway, measured, steady, final. They wanted to meet the owner, and I was already on my way down. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, and the sound that followed wasn't noise. It was silence. The kind of silence that happens right before a storm changes direction. Golden light spilled into the Grand Belmont's main hall, slicing across the marble floor and catching on the dust of chaos. Flowers lay scattered across the steps, the smell of roses thick in the air. Staff darted in and out of frame, carrying ladders, cables, and panic. And in the center of it all, my father was yelling. "Is anyone here in charge?" Richard Pierce's voice cut through the room. "This is unacceptable. We're paying for professionalism, not amateur hour." He stood beneath the chandelier tie pulled loose, his face red. I hadn't seen him in 7 years, but nothing about him had changed. The same posture of authority, the same disdain for those beneath him. Victoria Lane turned at the sound of the opening doors, her relief almost palpable. "Ms. Pierce," she gasped, stepping forward. "Thank God you're here." Every head turned toward me. The air seemed to thicken. I walked in slowly, not rushing, not pausing. Each step echoed against the marble, steady as a metronome. The sunset hit the glass behind me, throwing my shadow long across the floor until it brushed against my father's shoes. He squinted, irritated. "And you are—" I stopped, a few feet away. Hands clasped loosely in front of me. Madeline Pierce. The name didn't register at first. I could see the faint confusion flicker across his face. Then it did. His shoulders stiffened. "You're working here?" he asked as if the thought itself insulted him. "Managing this venue?" "No," I said evenly, my eyes not leaving his. "I own it." The words landed between us like a stone dropped into still water. The sound of footsteps, of distant chatter, all of it seemed to fade. Even the air conditioning hum went quiet. Eleanor was the first to react. She froze mid-step near the stage, her hand flying to her mouth. Catherine, standing beside her, turned sharply, her blue eyes wide. "Madeline," she whispered. I gave her a faint smile. "Hello, Catherine." My father's mouth opened, but no words came out. His disbelief was almost comical, if it hadn't been so familiar. He looked at me as if I'd walked out of his memory uninvited. "Con," his voice cracked on the single syllable, the old authority leaking away. "I heard someone wanted to speak to the owner," I said softly. "It's a pleasure to meet you again, Dad." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, reverberating, stretching across the hall, until every worker, every planner, every bystander stood frozen. I'd waited years for that kind of silence. Victoria, unsure of what to do, clapped her hands suddenly. "All right, everyone," she said, voice trembling. "Let's reset the sound system, please. Back to positions." The musicians hesitated, then lifted their instruments. A soft violin note drifted through the space, thin but alive. Richard still hadn't moved. His face had lost all its color. "You, own." This place he managed finally, each word slow, careful, as if saying them might change their meaning. "For nearly 3 years now," I said. "Through my company, we've hosted over 200 events, political galas, charity fundraisers, and apparently family weddings." His eyes narrowed. "You kept our name." I shook my head. "No, I kept my own." Catherine's voice broke the tension. "You're serious?" She looked between us, searching my face for any hint of mockery. "This resort, it's yours." "Yes," I said simply. Her lips parted, but no words came out. I turned slightly toward Victoria. "Please continue with the rehearsal. I'd hate for the Pierce family to look unprepared in front of the staff." Victoria nodded quickly, signaling the team. "Yes, ma'am." The lights flickered back to life. Music filled the room again, awkward and uneven, but enough to break the spell. People began moving, pretending not to stare. Eleanor stepped forward hesitantly. "Madeline, dear," her voice trembled. "We didn't know. I know I said not unkindly. You never do." She stopped, then her fingers curling in the fabric of her dress. Catherine just stared, expression tangled somewhere between pride and guilt. My father finally found his voice again. "This is inappropriate," he said, though it sounded weak. "You could have told us. This is not how family behaves." I almost laughed. "No, I said it isn't." He flinched slightly, like the words were sharper than they sounded. I turned toward the staff. "Everything's fine. Finish the setup. I want the lighting checked again before sunset." "Yes, Ms. Pierce," someone answered, and the words carried across the room like a quiet affirmation. As I walked toward the side of the hall, I caught Catherine's reflection in the mirrored wall, her head tilted, watching me with something close to awe. I pretended not to see it. Eleanor made a small sound, a breath caught between apology and disbelief. She took a step toward me, then stopped as if unsure whether she was allowed. I didn't turn. The music swelled, violins gliding softly under the hum of whispered voices. The sunset reached its last arc, painting the glass in shades of copper and gold. For the first time in years, the balance in that room shifted. The silence that had once belonged to my father now belonged to me. They had taken my voice once, buried it under their expectations, their pride, their shame. Now I took back what was mine, without raising it at all. And as the final note of the rehearsal echoed through the air, I let the thought settle like dust on marble. They had stripped me of dignity in silence, and now I reclaimed it the same way. Rain had a way of softening the noise even inside the Grand Belmont. By midnight, the storm had settled into a steady rhythm against the windows, the ocean wind pushing droplets down the glass like small racing lines. I was sitting alone in the VIP suite, the one reserved for the bride's family, though they'd all gone to their rooms hours ago. The air still smelled faintly of roses and wet stone. I had taken off my jacket, leaving it draped across the chair when the door opened without a knock. Catherine stepped in her reflection, catching the dim light before she spoke. Her voice shook, but not from fear, more from pride, hanging by a thread. "Was this your plan?" she demanded. To humiliate me in front of everyone, I turned my chair slightly toward her. "No," I said quietly. "You managed that all by yourself when you erased me from your guest list." Her mouth trembled. "You think you're better than us. You always have. Even when we tried to include you, you made it impossible." "You didn't try, Catherine," I said. "You performed." Her eyes filled, but she stood her ground. "You make everyone feel small, even when you're silent. You walk into a room and suddenly no one else matters." "No," I said softly. "You just keep looking for your reflection in other people's eyes. That's why you never see yourself clearly." For a second, the only sound was the rain against the windows. Then she whispered, "You always talk like you're above the rest of us." "I don't," I replied. "I just stopped apologizing for existing." Her breathing quickened. I could see the anger mixing with shame. She glanced toward the door, maybe realizing how different this conversation felt without our parents around to rescue her. Outside, a shadow moved, tall, quiet, listening. Bradley West. I caught the glimpse of his cufflinks through the glass before the door creaked open. "Catherine," he said, stepping inside, his voice low. "Stop." She froze, startled. "Bradley, this is between me and my sister." "I know," he said. "That's the problem." He looked at me, then back at her. "If this is how your family treats the one person who built her own life, then maybe I don't know this family at all." Catherine's shoulders sagged. The defiance bled out of her. "You don't understand. Dad and Mom." "I understand perfectly," he interrupted. "Your sister doesn't need to humiliate anyone. You've all been doing that to her for years." His words hung heavy in the air. Catherine turned away, her voice barely audible. "I just wanted one day that was mine." I stood, my tone softening. "You still have it, Kat. Tomorrow's yours. Just don't forget whose name built the ground you'll walk on." She looked up, her eyes rimmed with red. For a moment, I thought she might say something kind, or even thank me, but she only nodded, and walked out, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Bradley lingered a second longer, giving me a small, unreadable smile. Then he followed her. When the door closed, the silence returned, thicker than before. I poured myself a glass of water, took a slow sip, and stared out the window at the storm over the ocean. The clouds pulsed with flashes of lightning in the distance, their reflection flickering across the wet terrace below. That's when my laptop pinged. A new email from Linda Morales, subject line SEC confirmation. I opened it. "They've confirmed Andrew's forged signatures. Harold wants your statement before the hearing. The decision's yours." I read the line 3 times. Outside, thunder rolled across the bay, the sound low and patient. I leaned back in my chair, the glow from the screen lighting the room. My brother's name stared back at me from the attached document. His initials, his falsified numbers, his mess. For a moment, I thought about how easy it would be to ignore it, to let the world keep spinning, as it always had them, untouchable, me invisible. But then I remembered the night I'd left Boston, with a suitcase and no one following, the sound of my father's voice telling me to know my place, the way the elevator doors had closed like a verdict. I picked up the stylus and signed my name at the bottom of the file. The digital ink dried in seconds, a single curved line sealing 7 years of silence. I attached the file to a new message addressed to Harold, Stein@sec.gov. My hands didn't shake as I hit send. Outside, the rain thickened, drumming harder against the glass, each drop sharp as a heartbeat. Justice doesn't always roar, I said aloud. Sometimes it just clicks. Send. I closed the laptop, stood, and crossed to the window. Wind pushed the rain sideways, blurring the reflection of the city lights in the distance. The storm was coming both out there and here. One inevitable one overdue. Lightning flashed again, splitting the sky in white and silver. And in that brief electric silence that followed, I felt something I hadn't in years. Not anger, not fear, freedom. The headlines hit Boston before sunrise. Every newsstand, every tablet screen, every glowing ticker scrolling across downtown read the same thing: Pierce Capital. Under SEC investigation for fraudulent filings. At the Beacon Hill mansion, the morning papers landed with a thud on the marble foyer. Richard Pierce stood by the window, coffee in hand, scanning the front page until his face drained of color. His jaw tightened. He slammed the newspaper onto the table. "Andrew," he barked. "What the hell is this?" Andrew rushed in, tie askew, eyes wide. I don't know, Dad. The signatures, they're not mine. Someone must have hacked the files, or... "Don't insult me," Richard snapped. "These documents were internal. The SEC doesn't go public unless they have proof. Where did they get it?" Andrew froze. He didn't have to answer. His father's voice dropped, quiet now, dangerous. Who had access to those records? And then, as if the thought had walked itself right into the room, realization struck him. His eyes narrowed, the name slipping out like a curse. Madeline. The paper crinkled in his fist. Across the city, I sat in my office at the Grand Belmont Coffee untouched, watching the news ticker scroll across my screen. SEC confirms investigation into Pierce Capital, following report of falsified financial statements. The anchors were already speculating. The talking heads were guessing motives. None of them knew the truth, but they didn't need to. The damage was done. They once told me that business had no room for feelings. Now I was simply returning the lesson. I muted the TV. The silence in my office felt sharp, electric. The phone on my desk rang. For a second, I thought about ignoring it. Then I saw the caller ID, Richard Pierce. I answered. "Madeline." His voice started low, restrained. "What have you done?" "I didn't do anything," I said calmly. "I forwarded evidence to the proper authorities. You sent our family's business into an investigation. Do you have any idea what this could do to us?" "To you, you mean?" His tone broke into fury. "You can't do this to your own blood. I let the silence stretch. I didn't destroy anything, Dad. I just turned on the light. You built this family in the dark. Maybe it's time you saw what it really looks like." For a moment, he said nothing. I could hear his breath, heavy and uneven. "You think this makes you strong? You think exposing us redeems you?" "No," I said softly. "It frees me." He hung up. Outside, the sun was climbing higher, the sky turning the same color as steel. Somewhere in the house on Beacon Hill, Eleanor sat at her vanity, her trembling hands still clutching the newspaper. Catherine stood behind her watching. "Mom," Catherine said quietly, "was it true? What Dad and Andrew did?" Eleanor didn't answer. She folded the paper in half, setting it aside with slow precision. Sometimes, she said, her voice breaking the things we ignore long enough become the things that destroy us. Catherine blinked back tears. "We should have invited her." Eleanor's eyes met her daughter's reflection. "We should have kept her." Back in Boston's financial district, Harold Stein was drafting the official statement for the SEC's website. His team moved efficiently, printing subpoenas, marking evidence files with case numbers. Linda Morales, sitting across from him, handed over the folder I'd signed the night before. "She didn't do it for revenge," Linda said quietly. Harold didn't look up. Maybe not. But revenge tends to make good evidence. He placed the folder in the outgoing pile. "We'll notify them before noon." That same afternoon, Linda sent out the press release. Clean, factual, and devastatingly public. By evening, every business outlet had picked it up. The Pierce name, once a synonym for prestige, was now trending under financial misconduct. When Noah walked into my office, he was holding his phone, already scrolling through the headlines. "It's everywhere," he said. "You saw I did." He hesitated. "The timing. The wedding's tomorrow. What do you want to do?" I turned my chair toward the window. The harbor was calm deceptively, so the kind of quiet that holds its breath before the tide turns. "The wedding goes on," I said. Noah blinked. "Seriously?" "Yes, but the family." Your father. We'll have to pretend everything's fine, just like they always do. He didn't argue. He just nodded. All right. I'll make sure the staff knows. As he left, I exhaled slowly, the air leaving my chest like something I'd been holding too long. The phone buzzed again. This time it was Catherine. I hesitated before answering. Madeline. Her voice cracked. I'm here. A pause, then a sob. I'm sorry. For everything. For not inviting you. For believing them. For acting like you didn't matter. I closed my eyes. The sound of her crying took me somewhere I didn't want to stay for long. You don't owe me anything, Kat. I said. I do. I was so wrong. And now everything's falling apart. Maybe it needs to, she sniffed. Tomorrow's the wedding. Should we cancel? No. What? You'll get married tomorrow, I said firmly. You deserve that. Let tomorrow be a beginning, not another ending. She didn't speak for a while. Then, in a whisper, thank you. After the call ended, I sat there for a long time, listening to the hum of the city below and the gulls circling the harbor. My reflections stared back at me from the window. Steady, composed, familiar. They had built their empire on deception. I had built mine on silence. And tomorrow, for the first time in years, both would stand under the same roof. The morning broke clear over Newport, the kind of sky that pretends yesterday never happened. The ocean shimmered like glass, the air light and clean, carrying the faint sound of gulls from the harbor. Workers moved quietly across the garden, resetting the chairs and floral arches that had been knocked over by last night's storm. The world looked fresh, untouched, as if it had decided to give everyone another chance. From my office balcony, I could see it all. The white tents fluttering in the breeze, the photographers testing their cameras near the gate, the glint of champagne glasses being arranged on the reception tables. The wedding was happening, and I was still here. Down below, Catherine stepped out of the bridal suite, surrounded by a small army of stylists. The satin of her gown caught the morning sun, her train gleaming like something out of a magazine spread. From where I stood, I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept pressing her palms together. Eleanor followed behind her, dressed in pale lavender, the kind of color that tries too hard to look peaceful. She reached up to adjust Catherine's veil, her voice low but steady. Your sister's still here, she said. Don't forget that. Catherine nodded. Her eyes flicking toward the ballroom windows, where she must have known I was watching. For a moment, our gazes met, hers uncertain, mine unreadable. I didn't move. I wore a white suit that morning, simple, precise, the color of neutrality. My reflection in the glass looked nothing like the woman they'd once called an embarrassment. I rested a hand on the balcony rail and breathed in the salt air. I used to think I needed their apologies, their recognition, their understanding. Now, standing there, I realized I only wanted them to stop pretending. I just want them to have a chance to be right, I said under my breath. Behind me, footsteps approached. Bradley West stood in the doorway adjusting his cufflinks, the early light catching on the edge of his wedding band. He gave me a small nod. Ms. Pierce, he said quietly. I wanted to thank you. For what? For not shutting it all down. Not everyone would have had the grace to stand here after what they did to you. I looked at him. It's not grace, I said. It's exhaustion. You get tired of hating people after a while. He smiled faintly. I hope Catherine realizes how lucky she is to have you here. She will, I said. One day. He hesitated. And your father. I glanced toward the garden where Richard stood, giving directions to the ushers, as if he were running a corporate event instead of his daughter's wedding. He's exactly where he's always been, I said, trying to control something he already lost. Bradley nodded, then turned to go. For what it's worth, I'm glad you're here. When he left, I stayed where I was watching the guests begin to arrive. Cars pulled up the long driveway, women in pastel dresses stepping out, men straightening their ties. Laughter drifted faintly through the air, the kind that only happens when people don't know what's coming. A few minutes later, I heard a voice behind me, steady, but lower than I remembered. Madeline. I turned. Richard was there, hands in his pockets, his face drawn, older than I remembered. He looked like a man who hadn't slept. Dad. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he exhaled slowly. I owe you an apology. I didn't say anything. I should have seen what you were doing all those years, he continued. I should have realized it was you holding everything together. I studied him carefully. You didn't want to see. His eyes lifted to mine. You're right. Maybe I couldn't. Silence stretched between us, heavy but not cruel. He took another breath. You've built something incredible. You didn't need my approval, but I hope someday you might forgive the man who didn't know better. I stepped closer just enough that the sunlight fell between us like a line on the floor. I don't need you to see it, I said. I just need you to stop pretending I don't exist. His throat moved as he swallowed. Then, for the first time in my life, Richard Pierce nodded. Not as a father to a daughter, but as one professional to another. Fair enough, he said softly. From the terrace below, the first notes of the string quartet floated up through the air. Eleanor's voice called out for Catherine to take her place. The ceremony was about to begin. Eleanor appeared beside Richard, eyes bright with tears. She reached for both of us, pulling us into a hesitant, unsteady embrace that didn't quite fit, but didn't fall apart either. Catherine joined them, her veil catching the light, her eyes shining with something fragile. Remorse, maybe gratitude, maybe both. Eleanor pulled us all close, whispering, "You're still my girls." I stood stiff for a second, then let my hand rest lightly on Catherine's back. Through the glass, I caught my own reflection, 3 women tangled in the same moment, bound by blood pride and years of silence. And for the first time, it didn't hurt to look. The guests began to clap as the procession started. Catherine walked down the aisle on Richard's arm, the music swelling around them. I watched from the edge of the terrace apart, but not excluded. When she reached the altar, she turned slightly, her gaze finding mine. For just a breath, she smiled. Small, real, unperformed. I smiled back. The ceremony unfolded beneath a flawless sky. Vows, rings, applause. Champagne flutes clinked. The garden glowed in the afternoon sun. When it was over, I slipped away quietly, taking the back staircase up to the balcony, overlooking the ocean. The horizon was drenched in orange light waves brushing the rocks below. Inside the resort, the laughter and music rose and fell like the tide. I leaned against the railing, feeling the wind pull at my hair. Somewhere miles away, in a Boston office filled with noise and ambition, the name, Pierce Capital, was being whispered with suspicion. But here, in this moment, everything was still. Across town, Linda Morales sat in her office, watching the same headlines scroll across her screen. She smiled, closed her laptop, and leaned back in her chair. The light shifted on the water. The sky began to turn gold, and for the first time in years, I let myself breathe without expecting the past to follow. A week after the wedding, the air in Boston felt heavier. Humid, metallic, full of something ending. The city buzzed with news updates and whispered speculation. But inside the SEC conference room, everything was still. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly overhead as papers were shuffled across the polished table. The nameplate in front of Harold Stein read, Senior Investigator, Securities and Exchange Commission. He looked calm, methodical, like a man used to watching empires fall apart, one sentence at a time. Across from him sat my father and brother. Richard's suit was immaculate as always, but his hands betrayed him, fidgeting with a pen, the faint tremor of a man who no longer controlled the narrative. Andrew looked worse. He'd lost weight. His eyes darted between the door and the folder in front of him, as if either could save him. I sat beside Harold, not across from them, not as a witness, not as an accuser, just a representative of Pierce Capital's majority shareholder. Harold cleared his throat. After reviewing the findings of the investigation, it's been determined that multiple filings were falsified under your administration, Mr. Pierce. Richard didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the marble table. Effective immediately. Harold continued, the SEC recommends full suspension of Chief Financial Officer Andrew Pierce, pending criminal review and formal resignation of Richard Pierce as company chairman. Pierce Capital will undergo restructuring under federal oversight. The words hung there sharp and absolute. Andrew let out a strangled noise, half protest, half disbelief. This is insane. Dad, you can't just let them... Enough, Richard said quietly. His voice had lost all its edge. Harold nodded once and turned to me. Ms. Pierce, as acting majority shareholder, you'll need to sign the transitional agreement. I took the pen, the metal cold against my fingers. The document was thick, dense with legal clauses, but the meaning was simple. The Pierce empire was now under new hands. My hands. When I finished signing, I slid the folder back to Harold. The sound of paper against wood was louder than I expected. Richard's voice came low, rough. You didn't have to be here. Yes, I did, I said. He looked up, meeting my eyes for the first time all morning. You don't have to save us, Madeline. I'm not, I said evenly. No one's saving anyone. I'm just making sure you don't bury the company any deeper. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was hollow, like a house after the furniture's been removed. When the meeting ended, Harold shook my hand. You did the right thing, he said. Maybe I replied, but right doesn't always mean easy. Outside, the Boston wind hit like salt water, cold and bracing. Reporters waited by the steps, cameras flashing questions rising in a blur of sound. I ignored them, walking straight to the car that waited by the curb. By the time I reached my office, the storm had passed, at least on the surface. The harbor looked calm again, the sky washed pale blue. On my desk sat a single envelope, no return address. I opened it. Inside was a photo, an old one. It was us, the Pierces, Christmas maybe 10 years ago, Catherine in her first formal dress, Andrew standing stiff beside Dad and Mom, smiling the way only mothers do when they believe their family is still whole. I hadn't seen that picture in years. Before I could think about it too much, there was a knock at the door. Come in, I said. Catherine entered first, her mother behind her. Both looked out of place in my glass office, too soft against all the steel and shadow. Catherine held a small frame against her chest. We thought you should have this, she said. I took it from her. The same photograph. The real one, not the copy. I understand now, Catherine said, her voice quiet, but sure. You never left the family. You just left the silence. Eleanor nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. We didn't see what you were trying to do. You were right to walk away. I set the frame on my desk. The afternoon light hit the glass, scattering gold across the surface. For a long moment, none of us spoke. I don't hate you, I said finally. I just stopped waiting for you to listen. Eleanor reached out, touching my arm. We're listening now. Good, I said, my voice steady. Because I'm not repeating myself anymore. Catherine smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. You sound like Dad when he was still the man we looked up to. Maybe now he'll have to look up to someone else, I said. They both laughed softly, the sound light but real. When they left the room, felt quieter but not empty. The photograph still glowed on my desk, the reflection of the harbor rippling across it. I walked to the window, hands in my pockets. Outside, a freighter moved slowly through the bay, its wake carving a clean line through the water. My phone buzzed. A text from Benjamin Carter. We're ready for the next project. You in? I smiled, typing back 2 words. Always ready. The screen dimmed the reflection of the ocean, still moving behind it. I turned back toward my desk, my eyes catching the framed photo one more time. There we were, frozen in time, imperfect, unbalanced, but still standing. Silence used to be weakness. Now it was strength. The light in Newport always softened by late afternoon, fading from gold to something quieter, like forgiveness. The Grand Belmont's top floor caught the last of it, long ribbons of sunlight stretching across my office floor, touching the edge of the desk, where the family photo now stood. It had been sitting in a drawer for years. Now it was out-framed in silver, its glass reflecting the same ocean I'd built my life beside. Richard's face in the photo looked younger, less guarded. Catherine's smile was wide, untouched by the years that would come. And there I was, standing slightly apart, as if even then I knew that distance would one day be the only way to stay close. The window was open, the sea breeze curling the corners of a few loose papers. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the distant crash of waves. For the first time in a long while, the sound didn't feel like an echo. It felt like company. A soft knock came at the door. Come in, I said. Noah stepped inside a folder under his arm. The board's ready for the call with the SEC investors, he said. You want to run through the numbers first? I smiled, setting the photo back in its place. No need. They already know what we've built. He nodded, then hesitated. You look different today. How so lighter, he said, like something finally landed where it was supposed to. I thought about that for a moment. Maybe it did. He gave a small grin. I'll let them know you're on your way. As he turned to leave, I stood smoothing the front of my jacket. When I reached the door, I paused and looked back at the desk. The photo caught the sunlight one last time, scattering it across the wall. For a long second, I just stood there watching. My voice came softly, not for Noah, not for anyone else, just for me. I used to think I needed revenge to feel at peace, I said, but it turns out I just needed to be seen. The line of light shifted, flickered, and then steadied, painting everything gold. I walked out, the sound of my heels fading into the quiet hum of the hallway. The world outside had moved on. Richard Pierce now spent his mornings reading the paper on the porch of his Beacon Hill townhouse. No board meetings. No shareholders to impress. Eleanor had returned to her garden, her hands buried in the earth, her heart a little lighter. Catherine and Bradley had left Newport after the wedding, moving west to start something of their own, something without the shadow of our last name hanging over it. They were all still living their lives. So was I, just differently. Later that evening, I stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the ocean. The horizon stretched endless and calm, the wind brushing against my hair, carrying the scent of salt and rain. Below, the resort lights shimmered in neat rows, glowing like promises kept. I thought of everything that had led me here. The humiliation, the silence, the years of being underestimated, and how every wound had quietly built a foundation stronger than any revenge could have. Maybe that was the real lesson. Maybe peace wasn't about triumph. It was about recognition, finally being seen, even if the people who once ignored you never said a word. The sky deepened into shades of copper and violet. Somewhere far below, laughter drifted up from a wedding reception. Another couple's beginning. Another story entirely. I smiled. Life, it seemed, had a way of continuing without permission. My phone buzzed on the railing. A message from the Grand Belmont's media team video campaign ready for review. The power of renewal, I typed back. Perfect. Run it tomorrow. The wind picked up, and for a moment I closed my eyes, letting it wash over me. I thought of my father's last words in that SEC room. You don't have to save us, and how right he'd been. I never needed to save anyone. I just needed to rebuild myself from the ruins they left behind. The horizon burned brighter for one last heartbeat before the sun slipped below it. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't making someone regret underestimating you. It's becoming the version of yourself they never imagined possible. The waves broke softly against the rocks below, steady, certain, eternal, and as the last light faded from the glass, I whispered to no one in particular, this time they'll see me. The music from the reception swelled in the distance, and the screen of my mind went dark. Just my company's name glowing against the memory of everything I had survived. Pierce Holdings, fade to black.